The president released his budget last week, unveiling a plan for economic growth built on, wait for it, increased government spending, higher tax rates on smaller businesses, and soaring debt. Now, for many Americans, Obama's fiscal plan is more of the same. But what are the biggest surprises in the president's budget? Well, here with the answers in Washington, D.C. is budget expert and chief of staff at Economics 21, Jennifer Pollom. Now, Jen, it's good to have you here. And, talk a little bit about the president's latest budget. What are some of the biggest surprises that you saw?
Well, unfortunately, not to burst your bubble, a lot of this was kind of what we expected. The first surprise isn't really a surprise at all. It's that it's a political document. Rather than actually putting the time into creating a fiscal blueprint that would restore health to the nation's economy, the president unfortunately used this opportunity to create a political document that largely does nothing. The second point, non-surprise, is that it doesn't actually do anything. I think most economists on both sides of the aisle will agree that the looming entitlement crisis that we're facing is not only entirely foreseeable, but going to cause economic catastrophe in the next 2 decades if not addressed properly. And unfortunately, the president's budget fails to do anything meaningful to Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid. Problems that we see looming need to be addressed immediately, and instead of being addressed to restore the fiscal sanity of the country, both these entitlement programs will balloon from $1.8 trillion in 2008 to more than double at $3.7 trillion by 2022. The president's budget does absolutely nothing about our biggest problem.
Well, I know, and you saw that kind of interesting exchange between Timothy Geithner and Paul Ryan, where the Treasury Secretary is saying, well, we stabilize it for this period, but we don't really have a plan, but we don't like yours. I mean, what does that do to other countries that are looking at us, looking for some sort of sign that we're dealing with this?
It's an excellent point, and it can't restore sanity or actually instill any hope in any foreign nations in the U.S. economy, which, as we know, is one of the most important economies in the world. We already had our credit rating downgraded earlier this year, and there's been warning that unless we have a real plan to address the looming entitlement crisis, that we may be downgraded yet again, which would be catastrophic, in my opinion. Now, the real unfortunate part is Geithner and the Obama administration did recognize that this was going to be a problem when they formulated the Bowles-Simpson Fiscal Commission last year. The commission came forward with a serious plan that would have increased taxes. Some people may not agree with that part, but would have heartily addressed the entitlement spending problem. And instead of adopting his own commission's recommendations, Obama instead decided to completely ignore it, put it off to the side, and now we've got nothing to work from.
Yeah, we had the super committee, which obviously worked out really well. But talk a little bit about what happens to the tax rates in this latest plan.
Well, that actually gets me to my third surprise, which really is a surprise, which is this budget doesn't actually include the Buffett rule, which I think Obama has been on television touting at least every day, sometimes 3 or 4 times a day. The idea behind the Buffett rule, which isn't actually written down anywhere, so from what we can gather, the idea is that people who make over $1 million would be forced to pay at least a 30% tax rate. Now, there are a lot of moving pieces in how that actually would work. It sounds to me like a new alternative minimum tax, though there's never any conversation about getting rid of the current alternative minimum tax, which has been kind of a fiscal failure because it isn't indexed for inflation. But the budget doesn't actually contain the Buffett rule in any way, shape, or form. So I think we'd like to see that put down on paper, at least so that we could analyze what it really would do.
No, exactly. And talk a little bit, because, we keep hearing about the need, the president's been going around saying, the rich need to pay their fair share. But the taxes are already going to increase from the health care plan. I mean, is this just adding on to Americans' tax burden?
It is. It's adding on to Americans' tax burden, and I think that most people in the country would agree that if you make more, you can probably afford to contribute more. But what gets lost in that conversation is that over 50% of Americans don't effectively pay income tax now. So we already are talking about the 50% upper income earners who are paying 100% of the effective income taxes. And when Obama keeps talking about raising taxes on those who make over $250,000 a year, sometimes he morphs that into those who make over $1 million a year, depending on whatever proposal he's talking about. You're really talking about taxing the huge percentage of small business owners in the country. So most small business owners in the country, I think it's 8 out of 10, file not as corporations, but as individual taxpayers. So any income they make on their small business goes through their individual tax rate calculation. And as a result, if they're actually doing well, the dry cleaner, the deli, any of the other small businesses in your neighborhood that you can think of, they're going to be punished now and will be faced with, I think it's a 44% effective tax rate under the new Obama budget. And that, I think we can all see, is going to be a determining factor in whether or not those small businesses would actually hire another employee. Maybe it's going to force them to actually have to lay off an employee. So going from a 35% top tax rate, which it is right now, to what could be up to a 44.8% tax rate on those small business owners could be catastrophic to any kind of economic recovery that we have right now.
Not only catastrophic, but doing nothing for the debt or deficit. And, you know, the president came in saying he was going to cut deficit spending. I think it's almost triple now in his third year. I mean, how is that going to affect the next decade moving forward?
Oh, that's really interesting. We just passed yesterday or the day before, without much fanfare, that our debt to GDP ratio is now 101%. So we passed the threshold that most economists consider a real red warning light, where our debt of our nation is more than we can actually produce in the year. Now, Obama got elected. Part of his campaign platform was that he was going to cut the deficit in half in his first 4 years. That obviously hasn't happened. Instead, he, in the new budget, is creating $11 trillion in new debt. Under his first 4 years, he had $5.3 trillion in deficits. That's close to the accumulated debt of every previous president in history, with the exclusion of George W. Bush. And I think that's a really stunning statistic. Rather than actually cutting the deficit in half, his new budget will have trillion-dollar deficits as far as the eye can see. And this is really an unprecedented budget path in our nation's history, and certainly the opposite of what he promised.
Now, Jennifer, last year, the president's budget, I think, got no votes in the Senate. What do you see happening with it this year?
I would be hugely surprised if the president's budget is even considered on the floor of the Senate this year. Unfortunately, Senate leadership under Harry Reid has already indicated that no floor time will actually be devoted to the president's budget and considering it on the floor of the Senate. That's really unfortunate, and it does raise some eyebrows. It makes me wonder, first of all, why? It's a friendly party to the administration. Democrats are in charge of the executive branch and in charge of the Senate right now. And I think my opinion is that basically Harry Reid doesn't want his members to have to be on record as either voting for some of the stranger or more economically unsound proposals in the president's budget. And so he's not going to bring it up and force them to pick and choose.
Well, I guess we'll just have to wait until the election. Thanks so much, Jennifer, for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks.
And you can see more of Jennifer's work over at economics21.org. For PJTV, I'm Alexis Garcia.